that people are going to start to be let in.
All right, and they're coming in.
And then Matt, will
Yep.
you let me know when we're actually beginning? When everybody's in?
Well, like as soon as I hit start webinar, people who are waiting will start coming in. You'll see the attendees start to increase. It's right now at 0.
Oh, okay.
So, probably like 30 seconds and you're good to go.
Okay, thank you.
Good to go.
Okay, I know Eric's in and he's right next to me. And I know we have got about 50 students coming in. So tell me if you're ready, Susan, we can get started.
Right. Well, we have about 28 participants. I just thought, let's wait another minute or so.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Begin?
Okay,
Okay.
Susan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Scorbati, the director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College. Thank you all so much for coming for such an important conversation tonight. This is our second public policy forum this fall, where we're talking about our upcoming national election. And I'm going to turn over now to our president of Bennington College, Laura Walker, who will introduce our guest tonight, our state senator, Brian Campion, and then we're so pleased to have Governor Michael Dukakis with us to talk about, very, very important things that are happening now and are coming up very shortly. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and good evening. It is a historic moment in the United States. We're less than 2 weeks from the presidential election, but already 47 million people have voted. But tonight, we're actually an hour and a half away from the final presidential debate of 2020. And we are so lucky tonight to have someone with us who was once on that debate stage. So we're going to hear about what that's like. When was that? That was 1988, when Governor Michael Dukakis was nominated by the Democratic Party to run for president of the United States against then Vice President George H.W. Bush. So Governor Dukakis was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, where he is still today. And he began his political career as an elected town meeting member in the town of Brookline, and served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives before being elected governor. So kind of a little like Brian's trajectory. Governor Dukakis really dominated Massachusetts politics in the 1970s and 80s. During this time, the governor became familiar with the current Democratic presidential nominee, Vice President Joe Biden, when they actually competed in the 1988 presidential nomination. Biden withdrew from the race in September 1987. Governor Dukakis also went to a small liberal arts college, Swarthmore College, and got a BA there in political science. And it was really a formative experience for him, something that we all share, kind of undergraduate education in small, wonderful liberal arts colleges. He then went on to serve in the United States Army during Korea and received then after that a JD from Harvard Law School. And since 1991, after his governorship, and he has been a distinguished professor of political science at Northeastern University. So it is an absolute pleasure for me to be able to welcome Governor Dukakis to Bennington College, albeit virtually, and I one day look forward to an in-person visit. And so thank you so much for coming, Governor. And we are really also incredibly lucky to have with us moderating this conversation, our own Brian Campion, who is a supremely talented faculty member and state senator, who is also up for re-election, right?
I am indeed. Thank you. Terrific. Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Susan, and Governor Dukakis. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you here. You and I first crossed paths many years ago. My partner and I own a little place on Riverway, and you were walking to Northeastern, and I was walking out of our condo, and we had a quick conversation right around Bush v. Gore, and you were very gracious to take the time to talk to me. You even wrote me a follow-up letter. And here we are now in 2020, looking at an even more complicated situation going forward. But I thought we would kick it off talking about tonight. As President Walker mentioned, you have been on that debate stage. You know Joe Biden. And I thought it would be fascinating for students and faculty and members of the community and everyone watching to know a little bit about how you were feeling that day and a little bit about what those debates are like.
Well, good question, and I'll do the best in a relatively short time to answer it. Remember, these are very long campaigns. It took me a while to decide I wanted to run for the presidency. I loved being governor of Massachusetts. I was in my third term. We were really doing some exciting things for a state that had been in big, deep trouble back in the mid-'70s. And it wasn't until I began seeing the then Reagan administration engaging in what I thought was serious policy problems, especially when it came to foreign policy, that I even thought about running for the presidency. I was running hard for a third term as governor of Massachusetts, which I fortunately won. It pretty much decided that would be my last term, but there were a number of things I wanted to do to kind of complete what was a major revitalization of the state, its economy, a lot of the things that had plagued us in the '70s. And at first, when people were saying to me, really ought to seriously look at this and so forth, I kind of laughed it off a little bit. I love being governor. It's the best job in the world, believe me, being governor of Massachusetts. And I'd never really thought of running for the presidency. But we were getting deeply involved in making serious mistakes in Latin America. This may not mean much to at least the younger folks listening in on this, but we got involved in Nicaragua, and of course we had the Cuban thing, and it wasn't getting better. So I finally took some time after I was elected for a third term, spent a lot of time talking to people whose judgment I respected, and took 3 or 4 months to really decide whether this was something that I wanted to do. I was particularly concerned about my family and their reaction to this. Turned out they were more enthusiastic about it than I was. I remember my middle child, my daughter Andrea, who's now a reporter and a producer for Colorado Public Radio, saying to me, "Dad, very few people have this opportunity. You really should take it very, very seriously." And she was, 18 or 19 at the time. Right. In any event, I decided to run and began organizing. Ran a very good primary campaign and was fortunate enough to win the nomination. Then made some mistakes, unfortunately, in the final, which hurt me. My fault, nobody else. And lost to Bush 1. But there's nothing quite like running for the presidency, and I have to tell you, it's the toughest thing you'll ever have to do, but it's the most important thing you'll ever have to do. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a lot from that, but not enough to win the presidency of the United States. And here we are, years later, with a really strange presidential campaign. We can get into this in detail, but I don't think we've ever had anybody quite like Donald Trump running for the highest office in the land. It just so happens that my birthday is the 3rd of November.
Oh, wow.
I'll be 87 on the 3rd of November.
Congratulations.
And needless to say, I'd like to have a very happy birthday, including a win by Joe Biden. And we got, what, 12 days to go?
12 days to go. So you'll be watching tonight.
I will.
Yeah.
Not with great enthusiasm, because I thought the first debate was disgraceful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what Trump, I don't know Trump that well. I've never really met him. He did have some nice things to say about me in 1988, interestingly enough.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I thought his debate strategy was terrible. I couldn't understand why he was acting the way he was. It obviously didn't win him a lot of friends, because that was a disaster. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not he can moderate his whatever it was that he was doing in that debate, and make a little sense in the course of this. But at least the early reports are that he's going to be on the attack again.
Mm-hmm.
And I may be wrong, but I just don't think the American people are interested in an attacker. We've got a very, very, very serious public health problem, which they're not solving, which Trump himself is not solving in any way. And people are concerned and scared, and they should be. We're now at what, 223,000 people have died as a result of this, and there's no sense that our government is doing much to deal with it. In the meantime, he calls an extraordinary public health physician, who I think is admired by the vast majority of Americans, calls him an idiot.
Right.
I mean, what is this all about? I don't understand it. So we shall see with 12 days to go.
Yeah. And you would think, I mean, I think a lot of other countries are looking at us right now, and one might think that it should be a landslide for Biden, given some of the circumstances out there. Why isn't it? What do you think is happening that is getting folks that this could be still a tight race?
Well, this is a complicated country.
Mm-hmm.
We got all kinds of folks out there. Many of them, especially in parts of the country that have not done well economically, that don't understand why they're not part of a prosperous, growing America. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure I understand it, seem to be attached to this guy in some interesting ways. May not be enough to win this, but certainly enough to give him a good deal of support. And at least I find that puzzling, but maybe others don't. One of the great things I've been able to do since leaving public office is to teach at Northeastern most of the year, and then a winter quarter at UCLA. And I've loved the opportunity to work with young people. And I'm sure there are many at Bennington who have an interest, at least, in getting deeply and actively involved in public service. And one of the things that I hope will come out of our discussion this evening is a real understanding on the part of your students that there are great futures out there in public service. And our colleges, universities, I think, have a real responsibility to help train these young people for public service. One of the reasons, and I think Bennington does a fair amount of this, but I think one of the reasons that I've so enjoyed Northeastern is the co-op program and the opportunity it gives to young folks to participate actively during the course of their academic career, on the job, in service, and especially in public service. And I now have hundreds and hundreds of former students who are doing all kinds of stuff out there. some of them in elective office, some of them in appointive office, at every level, and have just loved the opportunity to work with them and encourage them to get into public service. So I hope your students will be taking that opportunity seriously as well. There's nothing more fulfilling than being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens.
Yeah.
And that's what getting into public service
I-
helps you do.
We do have a similar program, our fieldwork term, where students go
do.
come up to Vermont, I mean, up to Montpelier, and serve in the legislature, you know, by my side, other opportunities politically. And we even have a hometown boy here that was with you, DJ Wasik, for years. I think he was in your office, and DJ grew
Indeed.
up and also I think is putting his toe in a little bit in politics here. So
Good.
we had
Good. I'm delighted.
Yeah.
Delighted.
So right now, if you're looking at this map and you're looking at how things are going for Joe Biden, was it the same in 1988 for young people watching and listening? Were you focusing on those? Were you spending time in Florida or in, again, battleground states? Was it a very similar strategy, you know, back in 88 to what we're seeing now, or was it in some ways different?
Not quite as intense on a state by state basis, Brian. But part of that was my fault because I was a guy who had been elected to public office from the time I first ran for town meeting member in the town of Brookline by focusing on precinct-based grassroots organizing. When I first ran for the town meeting, I mean, you can't run for anything much lower than that in my town. I printed up some cards, went out and rang every doorbell in the precinct, and stood in front of the polling place for 13 hours and got elected. And that's exactly what I did when I ran for the legislature. Same thing, obviously with an organization, but I was out there literally knocking on doors throughout that district, one by one by one, and got elected. And although you obviously can't do that when you're running for governor, I had formidable grassroots organizations. Folks were doing that for and with me all over the state. Unfortunately, I made a few mistakes during that campaign, but one of them was spending too much time listening to folks who said to me, well, you know, that's okay for city council or something, but not for the presidency. You know, that's all media and strategy and that kind of stuff. It took a guy named Barack Obama to demonstrate pretty emphatically that a precinct-based grassroots organization gets you elected president of the United States too. And we did not do that anywhere near as well as we should have. But, you know, woulda, coulda, shoulda. I mean,
Sure.
those are some of the mistakes you make. And unfortunately, I made them in 1988.
And what about the media compared to now? 88 compared to 2020. You know, you not only have the internet and Twitter, all these things, but the media in general. Can you make some comparisons between what you had to deal with and what a candidate today is dealing with?
I don't think it's very different from what it was in 88, except for social media, Brian. I mean, that just didn't exist. It wasn't a factor. Now, how much of a factor is it today? I can't tell you that. You'd have to check with folks that know a lot more about social media than I do to do that. But clearly, that is a very different factor in modern politics, which just wasn't there in 1988. And you obviously have to take it seriously and try to do it as well as you possibly can, even while you're doing all the other things. Now, remember, too, that because of the pandemic, precinct-based grassroots organizing is very difficult.
Right.
I mean, people understandably aren't opening their doors up to folks that are knocking on their doors and asking them for their vote. So that has made this a very different campaign. I think in that sense, we'll go back, at least for folks who believe as strongly as I do that precinct-based grassroots organizing makes a huge difference. I think we'll go back to that, especially given Obama's example, which was really pretty stunning. But that makes this campaign quite different and really unique in that respect. I mean, how do you connect with folks when you can't? They're worried about who's knocking on their door and what he or she might what disease he or she might arrive with.
Sure.
So in that sense, it's different, and you'd have a better sense than I do at this point of how you make up for that. But I think you try to do the best you can with phones and emails and modern media generally to make up for the lack of an ability to do the kind of thing that guys like me believe in very strongly when it comes to campaigning.
The other thing COVID has done is, of course, is changing the way we all are going to vote, or at least many of us. Here in Vermont,
That's
everyone
right.
has a ballot at home, all registered voters. I might be the same in Massachusetts. I
It
know
is. Yeah.
during your on primary day, you just had people trickling in instead of the lines. Can you say something about, I mean, as a candidate in '88, we saw that the Carter Center is kind of putting more emphasis on their concern about the possibility of U.S. elections and our democracy being in decline. Were these kinds of things on your mind in '88? Or
No, they really weren't, Brian. And the notion that a foreign government or foreign governments would seek to influence what was going on in the in those precincts was just not part of our world here. Now, I'd be interested in your reaction to this reaction of our audience. I'm not quite sure I understand why we have adopted electronic systems that are invadable.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know what the story was in Vermont, although I assume paper ballots were often used in kind of the old-fashioned way.
Indeed.
We had voting machines
Right.
in Massachusetts, but they weren't digitized.
Mhm.
I mean, they were not electronic, and you'd get the count in a half an hour.
Mhm. Mhm.
And why we let ourselves embrace uh, electronics, which are invadable, if I could use that term again, is beyond me. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
You would think that somebody would say, "Hey, wait a second. Um, you know, somebody can get into these systems and raise hob with them." Um, why have we done that? I don't know. And I think, quite frankly, we ought to get off of that as quickly as we possibly can and go back to systems which simply, at least as I describe it, are not invadable.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean we'll solve everything, but to essentially adopt the electronic systems which can be played with and corrupted from outside makes absolutely no sense to me. And I don't know why people weren't thinking about that long before we got into this mess.
Yeah, even the inconsistencies within a state or these states around how people vote is always shocking to me. I mean, you know, Vermont versus where my sister is in Virginia versus, California, how we vote. There's no uniform process, which I think, could move us in just a more streamlined and perhaps safer direction as well.
Yeah, you got to watch the streamlining, it seems to me. How you do that,
Right, how you do it, making
and making it possible for others to invade those systems is just crazy.
yeah.
And I don't know why we've let that happen. So we've got some work to do.
Yeah. So if people are ready to ask questions, Susan is going to pose questions, but you can put them in, just go to the Q&A section on your screen, and Susan will be monitoring questions and asking questions for you. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask the governor, if Joe Biden is elected, what are the kinds of things you think a Biden administration is going to have to do immediately within those first 100 days? What kinds of policies, what direction do you think should be a priority for him and his administration?
Well, I'd say two things right away. First, bringing the country together again. Now, that's a broad statement, but I mean it.
Mhm.
We've had the most divisive president in American history who seems to get his jollies from attacking all kinds of folks. And I don't understand this. I mean, in my experience, and it goes back a long way, needless to say, my experience has been that people who get involved actively in public service and in politics, they may be conservative, they may be liberal, but they're nice people. I mean, they really care deeply about what's going on. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in public service in the first place. And secondly, with some exceptions, rare exceptions, they want to solve problems. It took me a while, Brian, before I began to do more listening and less talking. But what I discovered is that, particularly as governor, uh, if you put together a working group on a particular problem and invited key people across the board to be part of that, I don't remember anybody ever saying to me, "Sorry, Governor, I'm not interested." If the governor or the mayor or the president or whatever says, "Look, I need help. Will you be part of a group that puts together a national health program?"
Mhm.
People step forward. I mean, who doesn't think that working Americans should have decent, affordable health care? When I took a poll tomorrow, 93% of the American people would say, yeah, working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care. Well, when you have that kind of broad support, you're halfway to a solution. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but Americans want to solve problems. And if their political leaders ask them to participate in helping to solve those problems, they will do so. At least that's been my experience. Now, we haven't had this at all in this current administration. So, first thing Joe's got to do is to pull us together and say, hey, we're in this together. And for most of us, that's an invitation to participate actively. The second thing, obviously, right away, is to deal with this major public health problem and get going on it and get the kind of decisive leadership that we simply haven't gotten over the course of the past year. Now, there are lots of other things we ought to be doing. I've been deeply involved in the whole healthcare issue for a long, long time, and was deeply involved in Massachusetts' success in getting to near universal coverage before most other states. But to tolerate a situation in which we still have 20 million people in this country that do not have decent, affordable health care, I think it's just disgraceful. And it's not that difficult. So there are a number of those kinds of issues, especially the healthcare issue, which are really quite important. But bring us together and going to work on the, this virus and helping us all to first be treated by a vaccine that works, and secondly, to get back on track is really critical.
Yeah. I know some people are talking now about, people have been disappointed with the Supreme Court hearings that are happening right now, given the number of people that have voted and how close we are to Election Day. So there is talk out there among, I think, not only Democrats, but I think some Republicans also, that the president might want to increase the membership on the Supreme Court. And I'm wondering if that makes sense to you, if that kind of thing.
Hold on. The former First Lady just walked into the kitchen here. What's up?
The doctor said to leave the light on in the bathroom. So
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay. We both had physical exams today. Anyway.
Well, for what it's worth, my partner is sitting right to my left, making certain that I'm sitting up straight and answering the questions and asking the questions the right way.
Anyway, repeat your comment and question to me.
Sure. So does it make sense for folks to really have a conversation about increasing the Supreme Court at this point? Do you think that would be more divisive? Do you think it's just a must do? I mean, there's a lot of conversation about
I'm concerned about it.
Mhm.
And I'm a guy that loves history, and I remember when a great president named Franklin Roosevelt decided he was going to pack the court. And it was a disaster politically and otherwise. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take a good look at this, because I personally and lots of folks are not happy with what happened here, and especially what happened when a Republican Senate Majority Leader did something which I thought was outrageous and basically said, we're not going to act on this until we have an election and decide who the president's going to be. Okay, but what happened this year? We all know what happened. It was a joke.
Right.
And it is a joke. So it raises questions. I like the idea of a serious study commission,
Mhm.
which Joe Biden has now proposed, which will do its work in no more than, what, a matter of months,
Mhm.
and come back with recommendations on how to deal with the problem. And I think that's the way to handle it. But court expansion is a tough issue, and it's something we ought to look at very seriously. You know, we do have experience with Supreme Court justices who were supposed to be this way and turned out to be that way.
That's true. Yeah.
And even my classmate, who was kind of the leader of the conservatives on the court, and was an interesting guy, wrote the decision which upheld the right of government to regulate firearms.
Mhm.
That was a Scalia decision,
Hmm.
and the right one.
Hmm.
So we've got to be pretty careful about deciding that these folks all belong in ideological boxes.
Okay. All right.
Many of them surprise us. The current chief is surprising us these
Sure.
days.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I
No
think
question.
we ought to look at this very carefully, but I like the idea of a serious commission which will study it very carefully.
Susan, do you have some questions there? We have about 30 minutes left, so let's pull folks in.
Yes, we have some questions. So Governor, from a student at Bennington College, the question is, I wonder what is the difference in the platform of the Republican Party back then and now? As far as I know, the RNC is not running a new platform this year and framing it as an election of personality rather than policy. So kind of your
Well,
view.
I'm not an expert on the Republican platform, but I can tell you that I worked with some great Republicans in my political career. They were decent, they were thoughtful, in many cases relatively progressive. You know, Planned Parenthood was not a democratic idea. It was a kind of traditional Republicans who were deeply involved in creating Planned Parenthood. The folks, and I think this is probably too in Vermont, the folks that led the environmental movement early on, it really got us to be serious about not just about parks policy, but about environmental issues generally, tended to come from what we used to call the liberal Republican side of things, and were the leaders in our environmental organizations. And of course, you've had experience in Vermont with progressive Republicans, who many of whom I worked with when I was a governor. So I have a lot of respect for these folks, but clearly they've pretty much left the Republican Party, which I think is very unfortunate. And I can't tell you at this point, if Biden wins, it's hard for me to determine just what is going to be left of the Republican Party. Not that it's going to disappear, but um, it's going to take a long time for them to get back to that point where um, many of us who on the Democratic side worked with our Republican colleagues and did great work with them. And you don't get a sense that, with some rare exceptions, that's part of the Republican Party these days.
Even John Winthrop Sears, I mean, he ran against you. I suspect Mr. Sears was a pretty decent guy
He was.
as a Republican running against you.
Yep. And he wasn't the only one.
Right.
We had some terrific. I had some terrific Republican colleagues in the legislature, and loved working with them. And we got lots of stuff done on a bipartisan basis. They have all pretty much left the Republican Party, which I think is very unfortunate.
Has the Massachusetts legislature, has it sort of taken on a little bit more of a partisan, I don't know, feel to it compared to when you were there? Or is it still, I mean, I find Vermont, the legislature is quite bipartisan. I mean, I feel like we all do work pretty well together.
But you've had a very progressive Republican Party. I mean,
we have.
You know, I can remember, I mean, really extraordinary Republicans who were political leaders in Vermont, and with whom those of us in the rest of the, I mean, I was pretty active in the New England Governors Conference on a lot of issues, and worked very closely with Vermont Republicans. In fact, being a Vermont Republican was kind of a special distinction of sorts, and we worked very closely together. So I don't know at this point what's happening in Vermont on that score, but I can tell you that that the progressive Republicans that we worked with when I was both a legislator and governor have disappeared from the Republican Party in Massachusetts.
Yes, and in some ways, I think the progressive Republicans have become maybe conservative Democrats.
Well, or not so conservative, depending on what you're talking about. But in so many of these areas, especially environmental policy, our Republicans were very, very active. And they've either left the party or they're gone.
Yeah. Susan.
Sad.
Yeah, another question?
Please.
From another Bennington student. What do you think is one of the Biden campaign's main weakness in this election? And how do you think that the Trump campaign could play their cards to convert this weakness into a fatal flaw? So a real concern about right now, I think, what the Trump campaign could do that might, you know, really throw things into a very negative way.
Well, we'll see what happens in the debate tonight, but my sense is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and our ticket has done exactly what they should do. I mean, they're progressive, there's no question about it. But I think they're also bridge builders. I mean, I know Joe. He's a guy that instinctively wants to bring people together. He's very troubled about the current state of affairs in this country. And I think you'll see him reaching out if he wins the presidency. I think you'll see him reaching out to a lot of these Republicans that we've been talking about and seeing if he can engage them actively in what's going on to the extent that they're willing to do that. But that's who he is. And by the way, he has a very progressive platform. I mean, there's nothing wishy-washy about the kinds of proposals that he is making. But I think he will do so with with an approach and an attitude which we just have not had for the past 3 or 4 years. I don't know Trump. He did have a few good things to say about me in 1988, interestingly enough. I've never met him. But one of the things that I've learned, took a while, is that one of the tests of effective political leadership is whether or not you can be a consensus builder. And I got much better at that the longer I was in office. And we did lots of great things as a result. Trump simply doesn't understand consensus building. He doesn't understand how you bring people together and make things happen. And in fact, I began teaching this. How do you do this? By creating working groups of people across the board, some of whom don't agree with you. But to go back to the example of healthcare, if you went out and took a poll tomorrow and said the American people should, working Americans and their families, have decent, affordable healthcare, Susan, what do you think the numbers would look like? 93% say yes.
Mhm.
Well, if you start with that degree of broad consensus, then the challenge is, okay, how do we get there? But think about it. 93% of the American people believe that we should have decent, affordable health care for everybody. That's a pretty good place to start if you want to solve this problem. And I ended up having great success creating these working groups, bringing people in. And you know something? I never had anybody say to me, "Thanks, Governor, but I'm not interested." If the governor or the mayor or the president said, "I want you to be working with us on this," I mean, the overwhelming majority of Americans will say, "Yeah, I'll participate." And if 93% of the American people think that working Americans should have decent, affordable health care, you're halfway to a solution.
Yeah.
This administration doesn't even understand this.
Right.
Doesn't understand how you do this.
So on the
Yeah.
strength and weakness of the Biden campaign right now, would you say Senator Harris was the right addition to that ticket?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was a good one. She wasn't the only one, obviously, but she was a
Right.
good one.
Right.
And in point of fact, we have an interesting connection with her because Tony West, who was a wonderful, wonderful guy, was a young student at Harvard from California, African American, married Maya, Kamala's younger sister.
Uh-huh.
And we were at the wedding out in California, and he's terrific. Maya's terrific. I don't know Kamala as well as I know her sister and brother-in-law, but just terrific young people. And Tony ended up as the number 3 guy in the Obama Justice Department,
That's right.
and is now counsel to Uber or somebody trying to help them work their way through things. But yeah, I thought she was a good pick. I think she will be a fine vice president. Who knows what comes after that? But they got to win first.
Yeah.
And that's 12 days.
Any other questions?
Yes, this is from a community member and actually going back to healthcare, which you brought up. He's wondering, do you think Medicare for all has a chance in a Biden first term? And what strategy should he pursue to get that passed? How do you think healthcare should move forward, particularly in relationship to the pandemic?
Well, I'm a Medicare guy.
Mhm.
Why? Because Kitty and I are 2 of 65 million people right now in the United States that have Medicare because we're 65 and older. And it's terrific. Not only is it terrific, and this is not an attack on private insurance companies, but the bureaucracy, the administrative overhead, the complexities of the private insurance system drive you crazy. So I would like to see all of us covered by Medicare, but if people want to stick with their existing insurance company, I don't have an objection to that. I do think that people will migrate very rapidly to Medicare under an optional system. I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, the administrative overhead alone of the private system is just mind-boggling. We'd save billions by having a universal system. But if people want to stick with their existing insurance companies, I don't have a problem with that. I do think fewer and fewer of them will do that if we move toward a broad-based Medicare system. And let me tell you, just to repeat, for those of us who are 65 and older, Medicare is just great as far as I'm concerned.
Is our former governor of Vermont, Peter Shumlin, spoke to us about 3 weeks ago, and he proposed the same kind of thing. Dropping the age, first of all, of Medicare maybe to 60, and then raising up, at the other end, and gradually getting everybody covered bit by bit, and still keeping the insurance market open.
That's one approach, Brian. And I like Peter a lot, but it's too slow for me.
So you would
I'd go to a system in which you had an option.
Mm-hmm.
Either stick with your private insurance company or elect to be part of the Medicare system. Yeah. And as I said a minute ago, I would be astonished if the vast majority of Americans didn't move to Medicare very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's better, it's comprehensive, and it's cheaper because it doesn't have, what Medicare takes about 3% of the premium dollar for overhead. The private systems take 25%. That's billions and billions of overhead that would no longer be required under a Medicare system. But I don't have an objection if people want to stick with their system. I don't think many of them will. But
yeah, I think you're right. Susan, another question.
Yeah, from another community member. So going back to talking about the size of the Supreme Court, is that really the issue? Isn't the real issue that we need to depoliticize the courts? And of course, the DOJ, Department of Justice. So what's your view about the politicalization of the courts and of our Justice Department?
Well, look, anybody who thinks that our courts have not been part of the political system doesn't understand American history. You can go back to Dred Scott, for heaven's sake, and understand that. It's always been a political institution and continues to be. I just think the thing that got a lot of us upset was that the Senate Majority Leader made this big thing about how you shouldn't deal with Supreme Court appointments in a year where the president is being elected. That was kind of interesting when he suggested that, and he forgot about it pretty quickly when we faced the situation this time. And I don't know how can you explain that? It's one of those things. But again, I think you want to proceed pretty carefully on this before you then turn the Supreme Court into a super political operation that goes back and forth depending on who controls the executive branch, and I'd be concerned about that.
Okay. Governor, I just want to go back for a moment to tonight. I know students will be watching this evening, and it seems like this well-orchestrated debate in some regards. Maybe not so much with Trump, but in general, these debates look pretty well orchestrated. Just tell us a little bit about what it's like to get ready for one of these presidential debates. We know that Pete Buttigieg, for example, stood in during the vice presidential debate and practiced as Mike Pence for Kamala Harris. just tell us a little bit about how intense this kind of preparation is, or isn't.
Well, I think it depends on the campaign. I think I kind of over rehearsed, to tell you the truth, the second time around, and didn't do anywhere near as well as I should have in that second debate. Remember too, Brian, that most of us who run for the presidency have been in debates for a long time at
Right.
every level. And you as a state senator, I mean, you're used to debating. You do it all the time. So it's not something that's new or different or a radical change from what we do. And I think most of us like debating, to tell you the truth. Those of us who have been deeply involved in politics. I didn't do a very good job the second time around, and I made a serious mistake, mea culpa, in deciding from the beginning of the campaign that I would not respond to the Bush attack campaign. That was a mistake. You just can't do that. Doesn't mean that you should try to out attack the other guy. But the dealing with, for example, the issue of capital punishment. I was from Boston. Bush was from Houston. The homicide rate in Houston, Bush's hometown, was 6 times the homicide rate in Greater Boston. And in point of fact, Massachusetts has the lowest homicide rate in America without the death penalty. And it's a pretty liberal state. How come? Because we take community policing seriously. There's a reason that you haven't heard much about problems in the street in Boston and other Massachusetts communities. Because, for one thing, if I may say, I think Northeastern was the first university in the country to have a criminal justice major or something close to it. And it's not just Northeastern. I mean, we've had our institutions of higher education have had very good professional policing programs and majors, and that has made a difference. And not just in Boston, in communities all over the state. The head of the state police union, we've heard a lot about them, before he retired and then became the chief of the Harvard University Police Department. Bud Riley was a guy that I worked very closely with and had a lot of respect for. And I think it was mutual. But I never said that. Kind of dumb, right? In retrospect. If the other guy's coming at you because he's arguing that you're soft on crime. And look, you pay for those kinds of mistakes.
Well, I think it would be a wonderful opportunity following this wonderful opportunity for some students to go back and look at those debates and learn from those debates. I was 17 and not able to vote, but certainly remember some of those moments, and I would encourage students to do that. Susan, do you have other questions?
Yes. From a student. Do you have any particular opinions on voting reform initiatives? For example, compulsory voting, eliminating or restricting the Electoral College, ranked choice, and other kinds of measures relating to voting reform?
I'm a skeptic on ranked choice, maybe because I watched it, and I've watched it operate in the city of Cambridge, of all places, for years. And it used to take us forever to count the votes. And I've got some personal reasons involving my dear son-in-law in San Francisco, who was the runner-up in the Democratic primary for DA of San Francisco. And I'm not sure I understand quite where California is coming from when it comes to this kind of thing. But he never got an opportunity to run against the guy in the final, even though it's supposed to be an open primary. And he'd have beaten him if it had been just the two of them. So maybe that's too personal, and maybe that's
No.
not analytic enough. I think the electoral college should have been abolished a couple of hundred years ago. I could see no reason why we still have that institution, which, as you probably know, was largely designed to bring the slave states into the Union and make them a part of what was going on here. And there's absolutely no reason not to have the popular vote determine who wins the presidency. And I'd scrap that in a second. As you may know, Common Cause, among other institutions, has a proposal which would make it possible to get rid of the electoral college without amending the Constitution.
Hmm.
And we're about halfway there. And I'm all for that. I mean, it just makes no sense at all. I mean, you know, Hillary won by 3 million votes and
Right.
didn't become president. So there are opportunities there, but I think you want to be pretty careful about how you move on these kinds of issues. And I like the idea of a serious study commission to report in 6 months, which is, I think, is what Joe is proposing, which comes back with a series of recommendations to deal with the issue.
Great. All right, let's take a couple more questions, Susan. We're getting close to our time. Do you have another one?
Yeah, one
Great.
more, and then I have a question myself.
Sure,
So
absolutely.
okay. Are there, you talked about, how the importance of coming to consensus, right, as a deliberation.
Right.
Do you think there are issues, though, that should not be dealt with consensus and compromise? Like, where do you feel, are there certain issues that really need to be fought through the courts, or that, need to be dealt with another way?
It's a good question, Susan. Well, I'm a consensus guy. I mean, that's putting these working groups together, made up of people who began by not agreeing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them had opposed me on some of these issues. And I was amazed at how, I don't want to say it was relatively easy, but how we could effectively achieve consensus, and by that mean, and not with the lowest common denominator solution by any means. In fact, I learned a lot from these folks that we brought into the working groups who had not been supportive of my position in the first place. And I think they benefited from being able to work with folks who didn't agree with them. And we ended up in most cases with much stronger, much more effective solutions to problems.
So this is
Really,
something you used during your governorship.
yeah. I mean, it got so that we never went down the policy road without creating a working group.
Interesting.
Now, there are a handful of issues where people feel very strongly
Mm-hmm.
and where they may not agree. Okay, but tomorrow, having worked with folks on these issues, they'll be back working with them on another issue.
Right.
It was really very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a great talker when I started in politics, and we had serious problems. Massachusetts was one of the most corrupt states in the country when I first walked into the legislature. So we had to spend a lot of time in the 60s just kind of cleaning the place up. But it was amazing, and I was amazed to some extent at how effective these working groups could be, especially if a political leader at whatever level said, Brian, I want you to be a part of this. I know you haven't been agreed with me on a lot of stuff, but I want you to be part of it. And people were. They participated actively and really performed great service as part of these groups. So I'm a consensus guy.
Yeah. Bringing both sides in. That's great.
Bringing them in and listening.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, as I say to people, listening is a lot less tiring than talking. and you actually learn stuff.
Right.
But I mean that. I mean, I became a huge fan of putting these working groups together and then working closely with good staff and my own participation and so forth. But they make a huge difference. And of course, they create an atmosphere in which people say, "Hey, I mean, this guy, wants to listen to us, cares about what we think," and so on and so forth.
And everybody sort of moves the issue together, which is
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Susan, did you want to ask a question? Was that yours or?
Yeah, I had a question, I think.
Shoot, go ahead.
So in terms of, you talked about cleaning up corruption when you came into Massachusetts.
Yeah,
And I'm also, I'm involved in conflict resolution and mediation. So I totally believe in the listening and active listening. But when people are not rational and they really don't have any interest in you listening, I'm teaching right now a course on the democracy situation in Belarus with 3 other students from Belarus who are at Bennington College who have been active in the protests. And so we're really examining post-Soviet democracy in Belarus.
Right.
And so one of the things that we really have been studying about democracies, and we read Hannah Arendt's What is Freedom?
Right.
And how important that is, the connection to freedom with a democracy. So, I think what I wonder about what you think is that clearly liberal democracies, right, which I think have always had confidence in, at least, or have we, up until now in the United States, where we did have free and fair elections, the right to vote, with all the problems, right? We still believed the right to assembly, right? Free speech. What do you think about when democracies are actually moving towards illiberal democracies, losing some of these freedoms to the point where then you start to wonder, is it even getting towards totalitarianism? I think students are very, very concerned now. It's like, because what's so inspiring and hopeful right now about the people in Belarus on the ground is because they really have now, they believe that it's possible to move into a democracy that they can actually believe in, and are showing a lot of courage being out on the street.
I'll say, yeah.
I'm curious, just, do you think we in the United States are, losing some of these freedoms? Are we in danger of that? If someone's not being rational, can you listen to them? Can you actually negotiate? Like, what do you think about all that?
Well, remember, it's up to all of us who believe deeply in this idea to act. Even if we have, in this case, a president who likes dictators and doesn't seem to understand what democracy is all about. But we all have a responsibility to act. And I share your admiration for the folks in Belarus. I mean, they're taking their lives in their hands to deal with essentially this dictator. But I think I and most of us have enough faith in the American people to say, hey, we can make it through this, but we've got to stand up and we've got to be pretty emphatic about what we think is necessary. And let's not romanticize the past. Joe McCarthy, I just finished a biography of McCarthy. It recalled some very bad things that a lot of us lived through when that guy was around. The New Deal was an impressive thing in many ways, but there were serious reactionary groups, Father Coughlin, this and the other folks who were not Democrats with a small d. And think of the fights we had over the franchise, over whether or not women could vote, whether or not people of color could vote. How about Vietnam? I mean, I think all of us in this conversation were around when families were divided, the country was divided over what we were doing over there. And it means that we all have to work our heads off to make sure that this country focuses on the democratic path and treats this current situation as one that we've got to change for the better, and do it. And that's what the election on the 3rd of November is going to give us an opportunity to do. But, democracy isn't easy. And I hope we're all going to be smiling, and I hope I'm going to have a happy birthday. But it isn't going to happen just because it's out there someplace. We got to work. I'm encouraged by voter turnout, about the kind of activists that we're seeing, about the role of young people who, beginning during the midterms, really got deeply involved in the political process in a way that they hadn't been, and seem to be doing the same thing, Brian, these days in this election.
It's encouraging. It's very encouraging. And
It is encouraging, and it's great to see young people deeply involved. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and
right.
let's hope it happens on the 3rd of November.
Well, we all hope you have a very, very happy birthday.
Thank you.
And I have to say, Governor, having been with you now for an hour, I think everyone will agree, Vermont has had this wonderful, wonderful history of advancing things and being a leader in so many ways. But I'll tell you, Vermont made a mistake in '88 by not going Dukakis. There's no question.
How did I lose Vermont? Anyway, look,
all over again, I'm sure it would go blue. But honestly, on behalf of the college and President Walker and everybody who's listening, Susan Scorbati, we just all want to thank you. It was an incredible conversation, an incredible opportunity for our students. And hopefully, as President Walker said, we'll do it again, but hopefully in person.
And let me just say quickly, in wrapping up, to the students who have tuned in, if you want to talk about this or communicate about it, if you have a strong interest in public service, m.dukakis@northeastern.edu. Shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to be helpful.
That's an incredible opportunity and very generous offer.
Great. Thanks so much.
And thanks everybody for participating tonight.